Today in this video we're going to be ranking the NBA decades from greatest to worst. So let's get into our first decade, which is the 1970s. In the 1970s, the ABA and the NBA merged. The ABA had a high focus on attack and no defense. In fact, the unaverage scoreline may have looked like 120 to 130 every game. The best players of the 70s was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, George Gervin, Julius Erving, Bob McAdoo, and many more. A lot of people would put the 60s lower than this, but the 70s for me is the lowest. In the next position, we have the 1960s. This era had some freaks of nature, which is why it is above the 70s. For example, Wilt Chamberlain, who could bench press 600 pounds. Bill Russell was another absolute freak. He was at Olympic level for high jumping. He even tied Charlie DeMars before he went to Melbourne and won the gold medal and was the first ever person to jump over 7 feet. In the 50s and 60s, as I have combined them into one category, Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, Jerry West, Elgin Baylor, John Havlicek, Bob Cousy, Oscar Robertson and George Mikan were the best players in that era. Also, another reason that would put the players above is the amount of minutes that Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell and many others would play. In fact, Wilt Chamberlain only missed out on 8 minutes on an entire season, which is a lot of minutes and way more than any player could play today. Coming in fourth place, we have the 2010s, the decade just gone by. In this decade, we saw an influx of great attackers, but the defense was quite low, which is why it ranks here. We witnessed standout NBA finals like the Cleveland Golden State series. The best players in this decade were Russell Westbrook, Kevin Durant, Giannis Antetokounmpo, James Harden, LeBron James, Anthony Davis, Kyrie Irving, Steph Curry, DeMarcus Cousins, Klay Thompson, Kawhi Leonard, Blake Griffin, Chris Paul, and many more. As I have said before, the 10s is ranking this low as the level of defense has dropped, which I believe could mean that the players from the next decades could exploit this. Up next for third place is the 1980s. The 80s was a huge level up when speaking about talent compared to the decade before it. The Magic Johnson-Larry Bird rivalry was a spectacle. The Showtime Lakers with Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, James Worthy and Byron Scott were ones to watch. The Pistons went back-to-back, dominating the Chicago Bulls in the time. The best of the best in the 80s were Larry Bird, Moses Malone, Dominic Wilkins, Magic Johnson, Sidney Moncrief, Kevin McHale, Isaiah Thomas, American Dantley, Robert Parrish and Buck Williams. The talent in the 80s was way better than the decade before it, which started to bring light to the NBA and brought in more fans. The next one was a really hard pick, but I had to go with the 2000s. The Kobe-Shaq rivalry opened the start of the 2000s, but despite that, under Phil Jackson, they were able to earn a three-peat. Michael Jordan also had his last ride for the Washington Wizards, but was nowhere near as good. LeBron James entered the league and shocked everyone with his insane talent. The Pistons upset the Lakers to win the championship. Kobe Bryant goes for 81 points in one game, only 19 points behind Wilt Chamberlain's record of 100. The decade had an incredible amount of talent, but the best of the best in this decade were Kobe Bryant, Shaq, Steve Nash, Jason Kidd, Allen Iverson, LeBron James, Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, Tracy McGrady, Carmelo Anthony, Yao Ming, Ray Allen, and Dirk Nowitzki. For me, growing up in the 2000s, this was a nostalgic one, but I could not let nostalgia get into the way of this list. Before we crown the number one decade of all time, I have to give an honourable mention to the 2020s. The first finals series of the decade has already been one to remember, with the Bucks winning that first championship since the 70s. The upcoming players to watch are Giannis Antetokounmpo, Trae Young, Luka Doncic, Jason Tatum, Chris Middleton, Devin Booker, DeAndre Ayton, Michael Porter Jr., Bam Adebayo, Jamal Murray, Karl Anthony Towns, Ben Simmons, Donovan Mitchell, and Nikola Jokic. This brings us into the final decade, which is, of course, the 1990s. The 90s was a decade of the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan. The 90s started when the Bulls finally got over their arch rivals, the Detroit Pistons, in a clean sweep, which resulted in the famous walkout. The 8th seed Nuggets were able to pull off the biggest upset in playoff history, defeating the number 1 seeded Seattle Supersonics. Michael Jordan retired to play baseball and then comes back and proves he's back by dropping 55 on the Knicks. We had the flu game, the 2-ball three-peats, the rise of the Jazz, and the best players of the 90s were Michael Jordan, Charles Barkley, John Stockton, Karl Malone, Hakeem, Shaq, Clyde Drexler, Dennis Rodman, Scottie Pippen, Gary Payton, Chris Mullin, Reggie Miller, and David Robinson. The talent in the 90s was just uncomparable to any other generation, as the Bulls really carried that. If the Bulls didn't exist and there wasn't a dominant team like this, I think the 2000s would definitely be ranked higher than this, but the Bulls really carried this over the line. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you want to see more like this, make sure to like and subscribe, share it with a friend, and until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video.